The gunshot that killed Thomas Fletcher in the spring of 1876 wasn't meant for him, but it changed everything for Isaac Zimmerman nonetheless. Isaac stood in the dusty street of Deadwood, Dakota Territory, watching his business partner's blood seep into the dirt, feeling the weight of promises made and now inherited. Thomas had been shot in a card game gone wrong, caught between two drunk miners arguing over claims that neither of them actually owned. The bullet had torn through Thomas's chest, and he died within minutes, his last words a whispered plea that Isaac couldn't quite hear over the chaos of the saloon. Later, when the undertaker had taken the body and the sheriff had written his report, Isaac sat alone in the small office he'd shared with Thomas above the general store they'd been partners in for nearly 2 years. That's when he found the letters. They were tied with a faded blue ribbon, tucked in the bottom drawer of Thomas's desk. 23 letters in total, all written in careful, elegant script. All addressed to Thomas Fletcher from a Miss Beatrice Hartley of Boston, Massachusetts. Isaac knew he shouldn't read them. They were private correspondence, meant for a dead man's eyes only. But something compelled him to untie that ribbon, to unfold the first letter, to read the words of a woman who had no idea that her intended husband had just been laid to rest in Deadwood's growing cemetery. The correspondence had begun 8 months earlier, arranged through one of those matrimonial agencies that connected Eastern women with Western men. Thomas had never mentioned it, not once. Isaac read through letter after letter, learning about Beatrice Hartley in her own words. She was 24 years old, educated and working as a governess for a wealthy family in Boston. She wrote about books and music, about her love of gardens and growing things, about her desire for a different life than the one prescribed for her in the rigid society of Boston's upper middle class. Thomas had been 32, ready to settle down, wanting a wife to share in the modest prosperity they'd built with their store. He'd written to the agency, started this correspondence, made promises. The final letter, dated just 3 weeks prior, made Isaac's stomach drop. Beatrice Hartley would be arriving in Deadwood on the afternoon stage on June 15th. That was in 6 days. Isaac sat back in the creaking chair, running his hands through his dark hair. He was 26, unmarried, and suddenly faced with an impossible situation. A woman was traveling halfway across the country to marry a dead man, and she had no way of knowing. The postal service was unreliable at best out here, and even if he sent a telegram immediately, there was no guarantee it would reach her before she'd already left Boston. He should send word anyway. He should tell her not to come, explain the situation, express his condolences. Instead, he found himself reading the letters again, slower this time, paying attention to every detail. Beatrice wrote about wanting to grow roses in the West, wondering if such things were possible in the harsh climate. She mentioned her mother's garden, the hours she'd spent there as a child, the peace she'd found among growing things. She confessed her fear of the journey, her excitement about the adventure, her hope that Thomas would be patient with her as she adjusted to frontier life. Thomas had written back. Isaac discovered from the references in her letters, telling her about Deadwood, about the store, about his plans for the future. He'd apparently promised to build her a garden. Isaac stood and walked to the window, looking out over the muddy main street of Deadwood. The town was barely a settlement, swollen with prospectors and fortune seekers after gold had been discovered in the Black Hills. It was rough, dirty, and dangerous. It was no place for a Boston lady expecting roses, but Thomas had made promises. And Thomas was dead. The idea came to Isaac slowly, taking shape over the next 2 days as he handled Thomas's affairs. As the business partner and closest thing to family Thomas had in Deadwood, The responsibility fell to him. The store would be his now, along with the small house Thomas had been building on the edge of town. The house that was supposed to be for Thomas and his bride. Isaac walked out to the property on the third day after Thomas's death. It sat on a small rise about a quarter-mile from the center of town, where the chaos of Deadwood gave way to the surrounding hills. The house was simple, just 4 rooms, but it was well built with good timber. Thomas had been working on it every Sunday for months. Behind the house, facing south to catch the sun, was a plot of land about 30 feet square. Thomas had already cleared it, turned the soil, even built a fence around it to keep out the deer and rabbits. He'd started building a garden for a wife he'd never met. Isaac stood in the center of that empty plot and made a decision that would change his life. He would finish what Thomas started. He would build the garden, and when Beatrice Hartley arrived, he would tell her the truth, offer her passage back to Boston, and give her the choice. But at least he could honor Thomas's promise in this small way. The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity. Isaac had no experience with gardens, but he found help from unexpected sources. Mrs. Chen, who ran a laundry with her husband on the edge of town, knew about growing things. She'd managed to cultivate vegetables in the harsh Dakota soil, and she gave him advice, seeds, and even a few small plants she'd been nursing along. "Rose is difficult here," she said in her careful English, "but possible. Need much water, protection from wind. You build shelter." Isaac built shelter. He constructed a simple frame on the north side of the garden to block the worst of the wind. He dug irrigation channels, hauled water from the creek, mixed composted material into the soil. He planted the seeds Mrs. Chen gave him, set the small plants in careful rows, and in the center of the garden he planted 3 rose bushes that he'd paid an exorbitant amount to have freighted in from Cheyenne. He didn't know if they would survive. He didn't know if any of it would survive. But he worked from dawn until dark, and when June 15th arrived, there was at least the skeleton of a garden behind Thomas Fletcher's house. Isaac stood on the platform of the stagecoach station, his hands clean for once, his best shirt pressed, his heart hammering in his chest. He had no idea what he was going to say. He'd rehearsed speeches, practiced explanations, but they all sounded hollow in his mind. The stage was late, as stages often were. He waited as the afternoon sun beat down, as the minutes stretched into an hour, and then 2. He was about to give up, to assume she hadn't come after all, when he heard the thunder of hooves and the creak of wheels. The stagecoach rounded the bend into town, dust billowing behind it, and pulled to a stop in front of the station. The driver climbed down, began unloading luggage from the top. The door opened. Isaac saw the small gloved hand first, reaching for the driver's assistance. Then a green traveling dress, dusty from the journey. Then she stepped down, and Isaac forgot every word he'd planned to say. Beatrice Hartley was not beautiful in the classical sense. Her face was too angular, her mouth too wide, her eyebrows too dark and expressive. But there was something arresting about her, something that made Isaac unable to look away. She was tall for a woman, nearly 5.5 feet, with dark blonde hair pinned up under a practical bonnet. Her eyes, when she looked around the station, were the color of Clear Creek water, green-gray and intelligent. She saw him watching her and smiled, uncertain but hopeful. "Mr. Fletcher," Isaac's throat closed. He managed to shake his head to step forward. "Miss Hartley, I'm Isaac Zimmerman. I was Thomas Fletcher's business partner. I'm afraid I have difficult news." He watched the hope drain from her face, watched her understand before he even said the words. She was perceptive, this Boston lady. Her hands tightened on her reticule, her spine straightened, and she nodded once. "Tell me," she said simply. Isaac had planned to take her somewhere private to break the news gently. But she stood there in the street, surrounded by her luggage, waiting for the truth, and he couldn't make her wait any longer. Thomas was killed 9 days ago. A shooting in a saloon. It was quick. He didn't suffer. I'm so very sorry. Beatrice Hartley didn't cry. She didn't faint. She simply stood very still for a long moment, her face pale, her eyes distant. Then she took a deep breath and met Isaac's gaze. I see. Thank you for telling me directly. Her voice was steady, controlled. I suppose I should arrange passage back to Boston. You're welcome to stay as long as you need, Isaac said quickly. There's a boarding house that's respectable, run by a widow named Mrs. Patterson. And Thomas's affairs, there are some things we should discuss, if you're willing. She looked at him for a long moment, and Isaac had the unsettling feeling that she was seeing right through him, reading everything he hadn't said. That's kind of you, Mr. Zimmerman. Yes, I'll need a few days at least to make arrangements. He helped her carry her luggage to Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, made the introductions, and left her to settle in. He told himself he'd done the right thing, been honest, offered what help he could. He told himself that in a few days she'd be gone, back to Boston, back to her old life, and this strange interlude would be over. He didn't expect her to show up at the store the next morning. Isaac was restocking shelves when the bell above the door chimed. He turned, expecting a miner looking for supplies, and found Beatrice Hartley instead. She wore a simple gray dress, practical and well-made, and her hair was pulled back in a neat bun. She looked like she'd slept, though there were shadows under her eyes. Miss Hartley, how can I help you? I'd like to see it, she said. The house, the property. I know I have no claim to it, but I traveled a long way and I think I'd like to see what might have been. It was the last thing Isaac had expected. He should have said no, should have made excuses. Instead, he found himself nodding. Of course. I can take you this afternoon if that suits you. That would be acceptable. They walked out to the property at 3 o'clock, when the worst heat of the day had passed. Isaac tried to make conversation to fill the silence, but Beatrice seemed content to walk quietly, taking in the town, the landscape, the vast difference from everything she'd known. When they reached the house, she stopped, studying it with those perceptive eyes. He built this, most of it. I helped with some of the finishing work. Isaac unlocked the door, showed her the interior. The rooms were empty, waiting for furniture for life. Beatrice walked through slowly, her footsteps echoing on the bare floors. It's well made, she said finally. Solid. He was a practical man. Very practical, honest, fair in his business dealings. He would have been a good husband. Isaac meant it. Thomas had been a good man, and Beatrice deserved to know that. She nodded, accepting this. Then she looked toward the back door. May I see the rest of the property? Isaac's heart began to pound. He hadn't told her about the garden. He led her to the back door, opened it, and watched her face as she saw what lay beyond. Beatrice stepped out into the yard and stopped, her hand coming up to her mouth. For a long moment, she simply stared at the garden plot, at the neat rows of emerging seedlings, at the 3 rose bushes in the center, their leaves still green, fighting to survive in this harsh place. He did this. Her voice was barely a whisper. I did, Isaac admitted. After he died. He'd cleared the plot, built the fence. But he hadn't planted yet. I read your letters, Miss Hartley. I know I shouldn't have, but I needed to understand the situation. You wrote about wanting a garden, about roses. Thomas had promised to build you one, so I finished it. I know it's not much, and I don't know if anything will actually grow, but I wanted to honor his promise. Beatrice walked slowly into the garden, moving between the rows. She knelt beside one of the rose bushes, touching the leaves gently. Hybrid perpetuals, she said softly. These are good varieties for harsh climates. They might actually survive here with care. Mrs. Chen said they'd need a lot of water and protection from the wind. I built the windbreak on the north side. She looked at the rough frame he'd constructed, at the irrigation channels, at all the details he'd worked so hard on. Then she looked up at him, and there were tears in her eyes. "Why would you do this? You didn't know me. You owe me nothing." Isaac crouched down beside her, there in the dirt of the unfinished garden. "Thomas was my friend. You made a leap of faith coming out here, leaving everything you knew. The least I could do was make sure one promise was kept." She studied his face, searching for something. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded slowly. "What happens to this place now? The house, the land?" It was in Thomas's name. Since he had no family, it would normally be sold to settle any debts, but the store is profitable enough to cover that. "I suppose the property will be auctioned. And if someone wanted to buy it directly," Isaac blinked. "I suppose that could be arranged." "Why?" Beatrice stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. "I spent my entire savings on the journey out here, Mr. Zimmerman. I can't afford passage back to Boston. Even if I could, I have nothing to return to. The family I worked for has already replaced me. I gave up my position when I decided to come west." "I'm sorry. I didn't realize." "Don't be sorry. I made my choice freely." She turned in a slow circle, taking in the garden, the house, the vast Dakota landscape beyond. "I came out here looking for a different life. That hasn't changed just because the circumstances have. I'm a hard worker, Mr. Zimmerman. I'm educated. I'm practical. Surely there's work for me in Deadwood." "There's work," Isaac said carefully, "but most of it isn't suitable for a woman like you. The saloons are always looking for girls, and there's laundry work, cooking for the miners. It's hard labor and the pay is poor." "Then I'll take hard labor and poor pay." She met his eyes, her jaw set. "I won't go back to Boston, Mr. Zimmerman. I can't." An idea was forming in Isaac's mind, reckless and impulsive. He pushed it away, but it kept coming back, persistent as the wind. What if there was another option? "What kind of option?" "Thomas made you promises. He offered you a life out here, a home, a garden. Those promises shouldn't die with him." Isaac took a breath, knowing he was about to step off a cliff. "I'm doing well with the store. I can afford to maintain this property. You could stay here in the house. You could tend the garden. And in return, you could help with the accounts at the store. Thomas always said we needed someone who could manage the books properly." Beatrice stared at him. "You're suggesting I live here alone in a house owned by an unmarried man?" "Mr. Zimmerman, my reputation would be destroyed." "Not if we were married." The words hung in the air between them. Isaac couldn't believe he'd said them. Beatrice looked equally shocked. "You're proposing marriage to a woman you met yesterday." "A marriage of convenience," Isaac clarified quickly. "In name only, at least at first. It would solve the practical problems. You'd have a home, security, work. I'd have help with the business and someone to keep this house from standing empty. We could see if we suit each other. And if we don't, well, we'd have time to make other arrangements." It was insane. It was the most impulsive thing Isaac had ever suggested. But watching Beatrice stand in that garden, seeing the determination in her eyes, the strength in her bearing, he knew it was right. Beatrice walked to the fence, gripping the rough wood with both hands. She stood there for a long time, so long that Isaac thought she was trying to find a polite way to refuse. Then she turned back to him. "I want to be very clear about expectations, Mr. Zimmerman. If I agree to this, I expect to be treated with respect. I expect my privacy to be honored, and I expect honesty between us, even when it's difficult. You have my word on all of that. And I won't just be a housekeeper. If we do this, I want a real partnership. The garden will be mine to manage as I see fit, and I want a voice in the business decisions." Isaac felt a smile tugging at his lips. Thomas had chosen well, even if he'd never gotten to meet the woman he'd chosen. Beatrice Hartley had steel in her spine. Agreed. Equal partners. She nodded slowly. Then yes, Mr. Zimmerman, I'll marry you. They were wed 3 days later by the circuit preacher who happened to be passing through Deadwood. Mrs. Patterson and her husband stood as witnesses, along with Mrs. Chen. It was a brief ceremony, practical and unromantic, exactly what one would expect from a marriage of convenience. Isaac bought Beatrice a simple gold band from the jeweler on Main Street. When he slipped it onto her finger, promising to honor and protect her, he felt the weight of the commitment settle over him. This wasn't what he'd planned for his life, but standing there with this brave, determined woman, he couldn't quite regret it. They moved Beatrice's belongings into the house that same afternoon. Isaac had bought basic furniture, enough to make the place livable. He'd given Beatrice the larger bedroom, taking the smaller one for himself. That first evening was awkward, both of them too aware of each other, of the strangeness of the situation. Beatrice cooked dinner, producing a surprisingly good meal from the limited supplies in the kitchen. They ate in near silence, the clink of forks on plates unnaturally loud. "Tell me about the store," Beatrice said finally. "What sort of inventory do you carry?" Isaac latched onto the neutral topic gratefully. He explained the business, the challenges of keeping goods in stock, the difficulties of dealing with suppliers, the constant dance of credit and cash in a town where most of the miners were one bad day away from destitution. Beatrice listened intently, asking questions that showed she understood not just the surface details but the deeper complexities. "Do you keep proper books? A full accounting of inventory and sales?" "I try. I'm not very good at it, to be honest. Thomas handled most of that, and since he died, I've been scrambling to keep up. I'd like to see them tomorrow. If we're to be partners, I should understand exactly where the business stands." The next morning, Beatrice came to the store at 8 o'clock sharp. Isaac showed her the ledgers, wincing internally at the messy state of his bookkeeping. She spent the entire day going through the records, making notes, asking questions. By evening, she'd reorganized the entire system. "You're losing money," she told him bluntly as he locked the door at closing time. "Not a lot, but steadily. Your prices are too low on some goods and you're extending credit too freely." Isaac bristled slightly. "These are my neighbors, people struggling to get by, and that's admirable. But if you run yourself into the ground, you won't be able to help anyone." She showed him her calculations, the careful accounting that proved her point. "I'm not suggesting we become heartless, but we need to be strategic. The people who can afford to pay full price should. That gives us margin to help the ones who truly need it." She was right, and Isaac knew it. Over the following weeks, Beatrice implemented her system. She negotiated better terms with suppliers, adjusted prices, instituted a more structured credit system. The store's profits began to climb. But it was the garden where Beatrice truly came alive. Every morning before the sun grew too hot, and every evening as it cooled, she was in the garden. Isaac would watch her from the house, seeing the tension drain from her shoulders as she worked the soil, tended the plants, coaxed life from the harsh Dakota ground. The seedlings Mrs. Chen had provided grew into vegetables. Beans climbed the poles Beatrice set for them. Squash spread their broad leaves. Tomatoes hung heavy on their vines, and in the center, against all odds, the 3 rose bushes began to bloom. The first rose opened on a morning in mid-July. Isaac woke to find Beatrice's bedroom door already open, her bed empty. He found her in the garden, standing perfectly still, her hands clasped together, staring at a single perfect pink blossom. "It survived," she whispered as Isaac approached. I didn't really believe it would, but it survived. There were tears on her cheeks, glinting in the early morning sun. Without thinking, Isaac reached out and wiped them away gently. Beatrice looked up at him, startled by the intimate gesture, and Isaac realized how close they were standing, how natural it felt to touch her. He stepped back quickly. "It's beautiful. You did this." "We did this," she corrected softly. "You built it. I just helped it grow." Something shifted between them in that moment, something neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge. They'd been living together for a month, working side by side, slowly learning each other's habits and patterns. Beatrice hummed while she worked. Isaac had a habit of running his hand through his hair when he was thinking. Beatrice took her coffee with cream and honey. Isaac preferred his black and strong. They were becoming familiar, comfortable with each other. But they were still careful, still maintaining the polite distance of their arrangement. That changed on a sweltering afternoon in early August. Isaac was in the store when he heard the shouting from down the street. He stepped outside to see a crowd gathering, heard the ugly tone of voices raised in anger. He hurried down the boardwalk and felt his blood run cold when he saw Beatrice in the center of the crowd. She stood straight-backed and defiant, facing down three rough-looking miners. "Mrs. Chen stood behind her, clearly frightened. "What's going on here?" Isaac pushed through the crowd. "Your wife's defending a Chinaman," one of the miners spat, "sticking her nose where it don't belong. These men were harassing Mrs. Chen," Beatrice said calmly, though Isaac could see the tension in her jaw. "Making threats because her husband's claim is adjacent to theirs. I simply reminded them that threatening behavior is illegal." "Ain't no law protects Chinamen," another miner growled. "The law protects everyone," Beatrice shot back. "And if you're too ignorant to understand that, perhaps you should try reading." Isaac grabbed Beatrice's arm, not roughly but firmly. "That's enough." He looked at the miners. "Move along, all of you." The crowd dispersed slowly, with muttered complaints and dark looks. Isaac kept his hand on Beatrice's arm until they were well away, walking back toward the store. Mrs. Chen followed, murmuring thanks. "Are you insane?" Isaac hissed once they were alone. "Those men are dangerous. You could have been hurt. So I should have just stood by while they threatened Mrs. Chen. She's my friend, Isaac. She helped us when we needed it. I'm not saying you were wrong. I'm saying you need to be more careful. This isn't Boston, Beatrice. Out here, people solve problems with guns more often than words. Then perhaps it's time someone reminded them that there are other ways." Her eyes flashed with anger and something else, a passion that made Isaac's breath catch. They stared at each other, both furious, both breathing hard. Then Beatrice's expression softened slightly. "I'm not reckless, Isaac. I knew you'd come. I was just buying time." "You knew I'd come, of course. We're partners, aren't we? I trust you to have my back." The simple statement hit Isaac harder than he expected. Trust. In the 2 months since their hasty marriage, they'd built something he hadn't fully recognized until that moment. Not just a business partnership or a marriage of convenience, but actual trust. "Always," he said quietly. "I'll always have your back, Beatrice." She smiled, the anger draining away. "I know. Just as I'll always have yours." That evening they sat on the small porch behind the house, watching the sun set over the hills. The garden was lush now, full of life and color. The roses had multiplied their blooms, pink and white and deep red, their scent heavy on the evening air. "I've been thinking," Beatrice said, not looking at him, "about our arrangement." Isaac's stomach tightened. "What about it?" "It's working well. Better than I expected, honestly. You're a good man, Isaac, a better husband than I had any right to hope for." "Beatrice, let me finish." She turned to face him. "When we married, we agreed it would be in name only, that we'd see if we suited each other. I think we've established that we do. We work well together. We trust each other. We've become friends, I hope. Of course we're friends. But I find myself wanting more than friendship." The words came out in a rush, and Beatrice's cheeks flushed pink. "I didn't plan this. I certainly didn't expect it, but Isaac, somewhere in the last 2 months I've developed feelings for you. Real feelings. And I need to know if there's any chance you might feel the same way." Isaac stared at her, his heart pounding so hard he was sure she must be able to hear it. He'd been fighting his own feelings for weeks, telling himself it was too soon, too complicated, that she'd only married him out of necessity. The thought that she might actually want him, not just the security he provided but him, made something loosen in his chest. "Beatrice, I've been half in love with you since you knelt in that garden and touched those roses with such tenderness." The admission came out rough, raw with honesty. "I've wanted to tell you, but I was afraid. You didn't choose me. You chose Thomas. I'm just the man who happened to be here when you arrived." She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "Maybe I did choose Thomas at first, but I choose you now, Isaac, fully, freely. If you'll have me." He pulled her close, cupping her face in his hands. "I'll have you. For as long as you'll let me, I'll have you." Their first kiss was sweet and tentative, both of them learning the shape of each other's lips, the taste of each other. When they finally pulled apart, Isaac rested his forehead against hers. "I want to do this right," he said. "Court you properly, even though we're already married." Beatrice laughed, the sound bright and joyful. "That seems backward." "Most things about us seem backward, but I don't care. I want to earn you, Beatrice. I want you to never doubt that you're chosen, wanted, loved." "Loved," she whispered. "Loved," he confirmed. "I'm falling in love with you. I think I have been since the first moment I saw you step off that stage." She kissed him again, deeper this time, and Isaac felt the last of his reservations melt away. When they finally went inside that night, it was to the larger bedroom together, the one that had been Beatrice's alone. And when Isaac made love to his wife for the first time, it was with all the tenderness and reverence she deserved. The summer faded into fall, and the garden began to prepare for winter. Beatrice harvested vegetables, preserved what they couldn't eat fresh, and carefully prepared the roses for the coming cold. She wrapped them in burlap, built protective frames around them, and spent hours worrying over whether they would survive their first Dakota winter. Isaac expanded the store, buying the building next door and knocking through the wall to double their space. Beatrice's business acumen had made them prosperous, and they invested that prosperity back into the store, into the town. They became pillars of the community. Isaac served on the town council. Beatrice started a lending library, using books she ordered from back east, and taught reading lessons on Sunday afternoons to anyone who wanted to learn. They were respected, liked, seen as a solid couple building a life together, and they were happy. Genuinely, surprisingly happy. On a cold evening in November, as the first snow began to fall, Beatrice came to Isaac with news that made his heart soar. She was pregnant, due the following summer. Isaac pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. "A baby. We're going to have a baby. Are you happy?" she asked, her voice muffled against his chest. Happy doesn't begin to cover it. He pulled back to look at her face. "You've given me everything, Beatrice. A home, a partnership, love, and now this. I'm the luckiest man in the territory." Winter came hard and cold. The garden lay dormant under a blanket of snow, and Beatrice fretted over the roses buried beneath their protective coverings. The store stayed busy, providing necessities to miners and families hunkered down against the brutal weather. Beatrice's pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter months. As her belly grew, Isaac became increasingly protective, insisting she rest more, take on fewer tasks. She tolerated his fussing with good humor, knowing it came from love. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," she reminded him regularly. "I know. But you're precious to me. I can't help worrying." Spring arrived slowly, grudgingly, the snow melting in patches to reveal the muddy ground beneath. As soon as the weather allowed, Beatrice was in the garden, carefully unwrapping the roses, checking for damage. Isaac found her there one morning, kneeling awkwardly with her swollen belly, tears streaming down her face. He rushed over in a panic. "What's wrong? Are you hurt? Is it the baby?" She looked up at him, her face radiant despite the tears. "Look, just look." The roses had survived. Not just survived, but thrived. Each bush showed new growth, bright green shoots pushing up from the base, buds forming on the branches. Against all odds in this harsh place, Beatrice's roses had made it through the winter. "They're alive," she breathed. "Everything I planted, everything we built together, it survived." Isaac helped her to her feet, holding her close as she cried happy tears into his shoulder. "Of course it survived. You made it strong. You gave it what it needed to endure." She pulled back to look at him. "We did it together, just like everything else." Their son was born on a warm afternoon in late June, arriving into the world with a full head of dark hair and his mother's determination, if his lusty cries were any indication. They named him Thomas Isaac, honoring both the man who'd brought Beatrice west and the love they'd built in his absence. Isaac held his son for the first time and felt his entire world shift. This tiny person, this perfect combination of him and Beatrice, represented everything good in his life. He looked at Beatrice, exhausted and beautiful, and fell in love with her all over again. "Thank you," he whispered. "For saying yes, for taking a chance, for building this life with me." Beatrice smiled, reaching for his hand. "Thank you for finishing the garden, for keeping a dead man's promise, for being the husband I didn't know I needed." Little Thomas was a content baby, healthy and strong. Beatrice recovered quickly from the birth, and soon she was back in the garden with the baby sleeping in a basket in the shade while she worked. The vegetables flourished, the roses bloomed more abundantly than ever, and the garden became a source of wonder for the whole town. People would come to visit, to see the impossible roses growing in Deadwood, to walk through the organized rows of vegetables, to sit on the bench Isaac had built and simply enjoy the peace of the space. Beatrice welcomed them all, sharing her knowledge freely, giving seeds and cuttings to anyone who wanted to try growing their own gardens. The store continued to prosper. Isaac expanded their stock, began importing luxury goods for the growing number of permanent residents. Deadwood was maturing from a rough mining camp into a real town, and they grew with it. On their second wedding anniversary, Isaac surprised Beatrice with a gift. He led her out to the garden, where he'd installed a small fountain in the center, surrounded by the roses. Water splashed gently into a stone basin, the sound peaceful and soothing. "For the garden that started everything," he said, "and for the woman who made it bloom." Beatrice wrapped her arms around his neck, standing on tiptoe to kiss him. "I love you, Isaac Zimmerman. More than I ever thought it was possible to love anyone. I love you too, my brave, beautiful Boston lady who took a chance on the Wild West." They stood together in the garden as Thomas played in the grass at their feet, surrounded by the impossible roses, the life they'd built together blooming all around them. 3 years after their marriage, Beatrice gave birth to a daughter they named Rose, for obvious reasons. She arrived in early spring, just as the garden was coming back to life after winter. Thomas, now a sturdy 3-year-old, was enchanted by his baby sister, constantly wanting to help care for her. The house that had stood empty, waiting for a life that never came, was now filled with laughter and love. Isaac had expanded it, adding more rooms, a proper nursery, a sunroom where Beatrice could start seedlings before the weather turned warm enough to plant outside. The store had become the largest mercantile in Deadwood, employing 3 clerks and occupying an entire block of Main Street. Isaac and Beatrice had become wealthy by frontier standards, but they lived modestly, investing their money back into the community, helping new settlers get established, providing credit to those who needed it. Mrs. Chen and her husband had become close friends. Their son, born the same year as Thomas, was a constant playmate for the Zimmerman children. The ugliness of that day when Beatrice had stood up to the miners had faded, replaced by a community that had learned to be better, at least a little. On a summer evening, when Thomas was 5 and Rose was 2, the family sat together in the garden. Isaac had just finished reading a story to the children, and Beatrice was showing Rose how to gently touch the petals of a rose without crushing them. "Tell the story again, Mama," Thomas demanded. "About how you and Papa met." It had become a favorite bedtime tale, romanticized slightly for young ears. Beatrice smiled, pulling Rose into her lap. "Well, a long time ago, I lived very far away in a city called Boston. And I decided I wanted an adventure, so I traveled all the way across the country to a place called Deadwood. To marry Uncle Thomas," Thomas added solemnly. He'd been told about his namesake, the uncle he'd never met who had inadvertently brought his parents together. "That's right. But when I arrived, Uncle Thomas had died, and I met your father instead. And he built you a garden." Thomas loved this part. He did. "He built me this garden even though he'd never met me, just to keep a promise. And when I saw it, I knew he was a good man, a kind man, so I married him instead." "And they lived happily ever after," Rose said, even though she couldn't pronounce all the words correctly. Isaac caught Beatrice's eye over the children's heads and they shared a smile. It wasn't quite that simple, but the essence was true. They had found their happily ever after in this unlikely place, in this unconventional way. Years passed. The children grew. Thomas became a serious, thoughtful boy who loved books and learning. Rose was adventurous and fearless, more likely to be found climbing trees than playing with dolls. A third child arrived, another son they named William, who seemed to have inherited his mother's green thumb and spent hours following Beatrice around the garden. The garden itself became famous throughout the territory. People traveled from miles away to see the Zimmerman roses, to learn from Beatrice how she'd managed to create such beauty in such a harsh place. She taught anyone who wanted to learn, and soon gardens began appearing throughout Deadwood, small pockets of beauty in the rough frontier town. Isaac watched his wife teach and nurture, both her children and her plants, and marveled at how perfectly she'd adapted to this life. She'd arrived a Boston lady, educated and refined, and she'd become a frontier woman, strong and capable and deeply rooted in this place she'd made home. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Isaac surprised Beatrice with a trip back to Boston. The children were old enough to be left with Mrs. Chen for a few weeks, and he wanted to show Beatrice that he understood what she'd given up for this life with him. But Beatrice, standing on the platform waiting for the train that would take them east, looked at him with surprise. "You think I want to go back? I thought you might like to see it again. Visit old friends, show me where you grew up." She considered this, then shook her head. "My home is here, Isaac. With you, with our children, with the garden we built together. Boston is my past. Deadwood is my future." They took the trip anyway, but Beatrice was restless the entire time. The city she'd grown up in felt confining, crowded, artificial. She missed the big sky of Dakota, the honest simplicity of frontier life, the garden that was surely suffering in her absence. When they returned home, she rushed immediately to the garden, checking each plant, making sure the children had kept up with the watering, fussing over the roses like they were her children. Isaac stood back and watched, loving her fiercely for her passion, her dedication, her wholehearted commitment to the life they'd built. That night, after the children were asleep, they sat together on the porch they'd expanded over the years, looking out over the garden that had grown to cover nearly an acre. Roses climbed trellises, vegetables grew in organized rows, fruit trees they'd planted were beginning to bear. It was an oasis, a testament to what could be achieved with dedication and love. "I'm glad we went to Boston," Beatrice said, her head on Isaac's shoulder. "It reminded me how lucky I am, how right my choice was to come here." "You gave up a lot," Isaac said. "Comfort, culture, ease." "I gained everything that matters. Love, partnership, purpose. Our children will grow up knowing how to work hard, how to create beauty in difficult places, how to build something lasting." She turned to look at him. "Do you ever regret it, taking on Thomas's bride?" "You could have had a simpler life." Isaac pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of her hair, roses, and sunshine. "Not for one single moment. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Beatrice. You and this life we've built. It's beyond anything I ever imagined for myself." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars come out over the Dakota sky, secure in the knowledge that they'd found something rare and precious. Love that had grown from necessity into choice, from convenience into deep partnership. More years passed. Thomas grew tall and serious, taking on more responsibility in the store, showing a head for business that made both his parents proud. Rose, at 16, was courting a young rancher's son, much to Isaac's protective dismay and Beatrice's amused tolerance. William, at 12, had already shown more skill with growing things than his mother, developing new techniques for making plants thrive in the harsh climate. The garden had become Beatrice's legacy. She'd written a book about frontier gardening, filled with practical advice and hard-won knowledge. It had been published back east and was selling well, bringing both income and recognition. She received letters from all over the country, from women trying to create beauty in difficult places, thanking her for showing them it was possible. On a warm spring afternoon, Beatrice and Isaac walked through the garden together, as they did most evenings. Their hair was gray now, their faces lined with years of Dakota sun and wind. But they still held hands like newlyweds, still found excuses to touch and kiss when the children weren't watching. "You remember the first rose that bloomed?" Beatrice asked, stopping beside a massive bush that was descended from one of the original three. "I remember you crying. I remember thinking you were the bravest person I'd ever met, caring so much about making something beautiful survive. I was terrified it would die, that everything I'd given up, everything I'd risked, would be for nothing. But it didn't die." Isaac gestured at the garden spreading around them. "It flourished, just like we did." Beatrice smiled, that same smile that had captured his heart years ago. "You built this for me. Before you even knew me, you built this. And you made it bloom. You took a rough start and made it into something beautiful." They stood together in the garden they'd created, surrounded by roses and memories, and the life they'd built from an impossible beginning. 25 years had passed since that summer day when Beatrice had stepped off the stage, looking for a husband she'd never met, finding instead a partner she'd never expected. The house behind them rang with the laughter of grandchildren now. Rose had married her rancher and given them 2 granddaughters. Thomas had brought home a sweet girl from Rapid City just last month. William showed no interest in romance yet, too busy with his experiments in crossbreeding roses. The store had been passed down to Thomas, who ran it with his father's integrity and his mother's sharp business sense. Isaac had semi-retired, spending his days helping Beatrice in the garden, playing with grandchildren, enjoying the fruits of decades of hard work. As the sun set over the Dakota hills, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Isaac pulled Beatrice close. "If you could go back," he asked, "knowing everything you know now, would you still get on that stage? Still come to Deadwood to marry a man you'd never met?" Beatrice didn't hesitate. "Every single time. Even knowing Thomas wouldn't be there, even knowing how hard it would be, I'd make the same choice, take the same journey because it led me to you." "I love you," Isaac said, the words as natural as breathing after 25 years. "My brave Boston lady." "I love you too," Beatrice replied. "My frontier cowboy who built me a garden." They kissed in the fading light, surrounded by the impossible roses that had survived against all odds, much like their love. And as night fell over Deadwood, the garden settled into peaceful rest, secure in the care of the people who'd given it life. Years continued to pass, bringing both joy and sorrow. Isaac's health began to fail in his 70s, his body worn down by decades of hard frontier living. Beatrice nursed him through a difficult winter, her hair now white, her hands still strong from years of garden work. "I'm not ready," Isaac told her one evening, his voice weak. "I'm not ready to leave you." "Then don't," Beatrice said firmly, though tears streamed down her face. "We have more life to live yet, Isaac Zimmerman. More grandchildren to spoil, more roses to grow." He rallied, driven by sheer determination and Beatrice's will. Spring came again, and Isaac was back in the garden, moving slower but still there, still beside his wife among the roses. On their 40th wedding anniversary, the whole family gathered. Thomas and his wife, their 4 children. Rose and her husband, their 6 children and 2 grandchildren. William, still unmarried but happy, his greenhouse full of experimental roses. The house and garden overflowed with family, with love, with the legacy of 2 people who'd built something lasting from an unconventional beginning. They stood together in the center of the garden, beside the fountain that still splashed gently, surrounded by descendants of those first 3 impossible rose bushes. Isaac held Beatrice's hand, their fingers interlaced, hands that fit perfectly together after 4 decades of practice. Thomas raised a glass, his voice carrying over the crowd. "To my parents, who taught us that love can grow anywhere if you tend it with care, who showed us that the strongest foundations are built on respect, partnership, and the willingness to take chances on each other." Everyone drank to that, and then Rose spoke. "To the garden that brought them together and the love that made it bloom." More toasts followed from children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Stories were told, memories shared, laughter rang out. And through it all, Isaac and Beatrice stood together, the center of the family they'd created, the garden they'd built, the life they'd chosen. As the party wound down and the stars came out, the younger generations drifting inside, Isaac and Beatrice remained in the garden. It was their place, always had been the physical manifestation of their love. 40 years, Isaac said wonderingly. "It seems like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once." "We've been blessed," Beatrice said simply. "Against all odds, in all ways, we've been blessed. Because of you. Because you were brave enough to come west, wise enough to see possibilities instead of obstacles." "Because of us," Beatrice corrected. "Because you were kind enough to honor a dead man's promise. Because we chose each other every day for 40 years. They sat on the bench Isaac had built so many years ago, now worn smooth by decades of use. The roses bloomed around them. Generation after generation descended from those first 3 bushes, proof that beautiful things could not just survive but thrive in harsh places. "I would do it all again," Isaac said. Every moment, every choice, every challenge, all of it just to end up here with you. So would I, Beatrice whispered. So would I. They sat in the garden as night deepened, two old people who'd built something extraordinary from an impossible beginning. A man who'd kept a stranger's promise and built a garden for a wife he'd never met. A woman who'd arrived grief-stricken and uncertain, and made that garden bloom beyond anyone's wildest dreams. Their love story hadn't started with fireworks or grand passion. It had started with kindness, with the simple act of finishing what someone else had begun. But it had grown into something deep and lasting, roots driven deep into the Dakota soil, branches reaching toward the endless sky. As they finally made their way inside, Isaac paused at the door, looking back at the garden one more time. The roses were just visible in the starlight, beautiful and impossible and real, just like the love he'd found with Beatrice. Beautiful and impossible and absolutely real. Isaac lived to 82, passing peacefully in his sleep with Beatrice holding his hand, surrounded by children and grandchildren in the house he'd built for a stranger and filled with a family. His last words were a whispered thank you, meant for Beatrice, for Thomas, for whatever twist of fate had brought them all together. Beatrice lived 3 more years, spending her final seasons in the garden, tending the roses, teaching great-grandchildren the secrets of making beautiful things grow. When her time came, on a warm summer afternoon with the roses in full bloom, she simply sat down on the bench she'd shared with Isaac for so many years and closed her eyes. They found her there, peaceful and smiling, surrounded by the impossible roses that had survived and thrived and multiplied beyond counting. In her hand was a single pink blossom, the exact shade of that first rose that had bloomed so many years ago, when a Boston lady had first dared to hope that she might find happiness in this harsh, beautiful place. They buried Isaac and Beatrice side by side in the Deadwood cemetery under a simple stone that read, Isaac and Beatrice Zimmerman. He built a garden, she made it bloom. Together they built a love that lasted forever. The house and garden were passed down through the generations, carefully maintained, lovingly tended. The store remained in the family, a fixture of Deadwood for over a century. But it was the garden that became truly legendary. People came from all over the country to see the Zimmerman roses, to walk through the garden that had started with 3 unlikely bushes and grown into acres of beauty. They came to hear the story of how it began, of a man honoring a dead friend's promise, of a woman brave enough to take a chance on an uncertain future, of a love that grew from the most unlikely of beginnings. And in the spring, when the roses bloomed most abundantly, when the whole garden seemed to glow with life and color, people swore they could feel it. The love that had built this place, the partnership that had sustained it, the 2 souls who had found each other against all odds and created something beautiful that would last far beyond their own lifetimes. The garden stood as testament to a simple truth, that love, given the right care and tending, could bloom anywhere, even in the harsh Dakota soil, even between strangers, even when it seemed impossible. All it took was someone willing to build the garden and someone brave enough to make it bloom.